Now it is time for our first panel. Leading this fine group is Dr. Nicholas Dumovich. Nick has served as a CIA historian since January of 2005. He came to the agency in 1990 as an analyst on the Soviet Union. He has also served as speechwriter for directors of Central Intelligence, Don Deutsch and George Tenet, and was the deputy chief editor of the President's Daily Brief. He's a frequent contributor to Studies in Intelligence and other journals, as well as an author. As a matter of fact, he wrote The Literary Spy under the pen name Charles Lathrop. Well, so much for that color. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Nick Dumovich.
Thank you, Doak. I have had the honor and privilege of being a CIA historian, CIA staff historian, which is about as interesting as it sounds, for the last 6 years, and been working with Duke for the last 2 on this particular event. The history staff at CIA is part of the Center for the Study of Intelligence, which is the agency's internal think tank. And we are proud to be co-sponsors of this event, along with the Historical Collection Division, our expert declassifiers of historical documents, and who did this wonderful brochure that you all have access to. The panel, the first of 2 we have today, its subject is Reagan's use of intelligence from the perspective of CIA. The second panel later on will deal with the policymaker perspective, but for now, our focus is on the intelligence itself, how it was produced, tasked, delivered, the interactions between the intelligence people and the policy folk, and issues surrounding all those matters. Common misperception that intelligence analysis is predominantly prediction. It's not. Analysis is foremost about understanding what is and where things might go. But I will attempt to predict what our panelists will say as I introduce all 4 of them before we begin the discussion. Our first panelist will be Doug McCacken, former Deputy Director of Intelligence, which is the chief of the Analytic Directorate. During much of the Reagan administration, he was the chief of the Soviet Analytic Shop. And on at least 2 occasions, personally briefed the president. He will give us an overview of CIA's Soviet assessments, particularly on the Soviet economy and on the military, and on the analysis that said that the situation was unsustainable. I hope he will also find time to speak about his creation of the Societal Issues Branch, a matter of great personal interest to President Reagan, and I hope he's going to do all this in about 10 minutes. I need to say we want to leave plenty of time at the end for question and answer and additional commentary from the panelists, so I've asked each of them to limit his initial remarks to 10 minutes or so. The second panelist is David Lodge. If you want to know what a genuine CIA Kremlinologist looks like, there he is. He did much of the agency's work on Soviet leadership analysis during this period. I've asked him to speak about that work, especially with regard to the Soviet succession issue, which kept coming up again and again. How that analysis was tasked, how it was packaged, delivered, and regarded by the Reagan White House. Dr. Bruce Berkowitz is our third panelist. He's a well-known and highly respected scholar of the intelligence discipline who got his start as a CIA political military analyst on the USSR in the late 1970s and early 1980s. His essay on the intelligence record regarding the USSR is in the Symposium booklet. It's well worth your time to read. I hope he will summarize some of the points from there and also give us an insight into the internal zeitgeist of the Soviet analysts at the time. What were they considering with regard to the Soviet Union? And I hope he will address the successes, the sources of our success at CIA, as well as the shortcomings. Finally, we will have Admiral Bobby Ray Inman speak. He was director of the National Security Agency when he answered President Reagan's personal appeal to him to become deputy director of Central Intelligence under William Casey. It's safe to say that the admiral had some concerns about that assignment, but he did it anyway for his president. Very much appreciate your service, sir, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
So with that, let's start with Doug McCacken, who will set us straight on the record of the Soviet analysis.
Well, I can't do that in 10 minutes. So,
I know.
And I will, however, try to make as straightforward a statement as I can, so I'll be missing some of the subtleties that would be appropriate given some of the atmosphere. I characterize the intelligence and the Reagan administration, and that was the title of our panel, so that's what I was focused on. I would say essentially it broke into two different periods. The first period, entry into office with all of the administration, I will say tense. And nothing new about that in the sense that it is always that way. In comes the group, they have an idea, they just defeated the previous group whose ideas were clearly wrong, and one of the reasons they were wrong is those stupid intelligence people gave them bum scoop, and so they got it all wrong. We're going to get it right, and the first thing we got to do is fix intelligence. Now, you may think I'm exaggerating some of this stuff I'll be talking about, but I brought a few documents with me. I can back up everything I'm going to describe here.
You can.
And some of them are on the book that you got in the disc, and a whole lot of them aren't. But as I say, to begin with, it was the United States is immortal, and this had started back in the 70s. It had built up, and some of you have heard of Team B. And it was all about how you've jeopardized the security of the United States by underestimating the magnitude of the Soviet threat. The second period, I would argue, began about 1985 when two things happened. One, I think, and I'm going to have David talk about some of this later, the president himself, contrary to what many of his close associates were saying, the president himself had started to read a lot of the intelligence about the economic and social issues there, and we did create the societal branch specifically because our concern was that all the talk about the Soviet Union was missiles or no missiles, bomb versus shoot, and there was a society there, and there was a history there, and there were all kinds of ethnic differences, and that these had a direct effect on the sustainability of the system, in addition to the fact that the economy was going down the tubes, and we had been saying that repeatedly. Now, how were those aspects treated? One, on the status of the threat, the nuclear threat. I'll keep glancing at my watch, if you excuse me. The first thing we heard and were subjected to was an explanation of why we had got it dramatically wrong. Now, by this time, we already had the SALT Treaty, and so the SALT Treaty did fix certain numerical limits. And secondly, we had some pretty good collection capabilities now. We could count silos and lots of tanks. And in fact, I was once asked by, how we got Soviet military manpower, and we told them it was simple. We took satellite imagery of the boots, divide by 2, and come up with the numbers. But anyway, we did have a pretty good set on what was there, and it held up later even when we got the on-site inspections. So the argument was over the intention about the buildup in the future. And the first day my first couple years in the Reagan administration, I was a PDB briefer myself then, but I moved into the Soviet office in '84, and two messages were given to me, one by my predecessor who was outgoing about the bow wave. And that was every year we projected a huge increase in Soviet military buildup spending, and every year it didn't happen the next year, so we just pushed the bow wave out another year and another year and another year, and up, and we never got there. The second thing that hit me is as I had been looking at these figures and talking to some of the analysts, I got a call from a senior official in the administration whose name I cannot deny or reveal, Actually, I got a call from a senior person inside CIA who had just gotten a call from a senior administration figure who said, why was it CIA every year was underestimating the Soviet buildup? And my response was, sorry to say, every year we have been overestimating it, not underestimating it, and I will get you the data, which we did get, and we put together, and is in a paper which has now been declassified, long, not in this package, but the fact of the matter is, beginning about the mid-70s up until the mid-80s, every year we made a projection, and the NIEs had two different sets of projections. One was no start, i.e. the Soviet Union broke the treaty, and this is what they would have. Well, we didn't bother with that one because that was a free floating atmospheric world. You could invent anything you want. So what we did is we took a look at the projections, the other set. If they stay with the overall limit, but modernize with new, more capable systems, here's our projection. And I can show you the charts that will say for the next 10 years, we gave a low side and a high side. And at the end of the period, they never got to the low side. And that's that's provable. Now, that was part of the atmosphere in coming in. And the second thing is, and I've got documents, all this talk about us overestimating the Soviet economy, we got hammered for underestimating it, for saying it was too low. And one of my best days of my career was when I got a letter from a senior official complaining, which is in my briefcase, but I won't show it to you. Saved it with my family jewels. Saying, I was sick and tired of seeing you guys giving this 1.5% to 2% growth rate every year when you were way under. And the very day an outside expert in some academic institution was criticizing us for this inflated estimate of 2% growth a year. So this is what it's like in intelligence. You make one person happy, you're going to make another one unhappy, or if you're lucky, you'll make them both unhappy. Anyway, but the economy, and this is where the transition took place. Because the president was paying attention to these things, and I heard it from a lot of sources with access, that he was actually interested in this subject. I also heard, and I'll let David talk about this, that he was very interested in starting to read all the things we were talking about the societal issues and how they were undermining the system itself. First thing, during the transition, the first thing we faced, you couldn't deny the fact any longer the economy was, I won't use the correct word for it, unsociable word, but anyway, the economy was going down the tubes, and they were having a lot of problems. The first response was, well, that's all right. They'll still build up their military forces and make the populace suffer. By the time Gorbachev came in, it was a pretty hard case to make. So the next one was, Gorbachev is going to lure us into complacency, use arms control to kind of cut the thing down for a while they repair their economy, and then once they get that thing going again, boom, out it'll go. And that one didn't get a whole lot of traction around a lot of people. And here's where I would argue that based on everything from the perspective I had, it was the president and himself who started talking about the idea, believe it or not, of zero nukes. And if you check in your documents, you'll see the number of times he raises that in discussions. He got to Moscow, or excuse me, first he got to Geneva. And people ask me, when did the Cold War end? Well, the ending started November 1985 in Geneva. Because Gorbachev and the president agreed that what they wanted to do was stop this confrontational situation, both in the nuclear arms and in the other war field, which the director of CIA had taken on as his main equivalent of a Secretary of Defense in the Third World, in Angola and Sudan and various Central America, where we had a few problems emerge during that period. So it really did change. And after that, the role of the intelligence with the president and with his closest advisors, and some of them still didn't want to buy into it, was there's an opportunity here. This system is failing, but we have the chance Mikhail and I, to take this thing down the right road. And I will argue that was the historical seismic change that took place. And I would remind you that that was in '85. 2 years later, we signed with all those problems you heard about, the negotiations and the summits, we signed the INF Treaty. And in 1988, we had an election. There's one thing I forgot to mention, by the way. And the vice president of that administration became the president, and they basically continued that momentum to the end station, START 1, START 2, Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the reduction of conventional forces in Europe. So those years transformed, and I would argue, the geopolitical situation. By the way, I should say one more thing. And I mentioned this first period when it was all so tense. We had another thing that was giving us a lot of problems in intelligence, in addition to the economic and the military, and that is, who the hell is going to be the next guy to take over there? Because the President Reagan came in, Brezhnev was already so feeble, we had actually had to help President Carter work out a way to walk him up and down the steps in '79 in Vienna to sign the SALT II treaty. So he died. He died in '82. In comes Andropov, who lasted about 13 months, about the last 6 months of which we were hearing music over the radio daily as he was laying in bed comatose. Then we had Chernenko came in, and he was already practically dead by the time he walked into office. And what will be fascinating is what I'm saying is you look at the debates on the succession, and you'll see people saying, oh, this guy Grishin's going to follow Chernenko. And that was coming out of our embassy in Moscow, who were talking to local apparatchiki, and we were talking to people like General Kalugin, who were in various other places, and they were all telling us it was going to be Gorbachev, and that's who it was. And last point, yeah, I'm there. Prediction, right. If I had one thing I would do to try to reform intelligence, I'd get a hold of every dictionary there is and have the word predict redacted. We can forecast like you do weather. There's a force here, there's forces there, this is going on. Now, how can this play out? Because, what will affect it? What is it that we don't know about that might have an impact here? What is it that might be added to the situation? Because Mr. Policy Person, Mr. or Mrs. Policy Person, I've got to watch out where I'm living today. There's something you might be able to want to inject into that to affect how it plays out. Instead of predicting it will or won't, because if you'll check predictions, the prediction they would never wreck détente and invade Czechoslovakia just because, 3 days before Brezhnev and I have agreed to go on television and announce the beginning of the strategic arms limitation talks, or they're never going to invade Afghanistan. Well, I've got my START II treaty, or SALT II treaty, sitting up on Capitol Hill waiting for confirmation. So nobody has a monopoly on mindset or preference. But yeah, I would agree. Get the predictions out of here. If you check the written record, by 1988, you will find documents that say there's a good chance that by the end of this, before the end of the decade, Gorbachev will undertake unilateral military reductions, which he did before the end of it. He announced it up in New York on the 7th of December, 1988. And he made unilateral cuts, pulled all those forces out, not all the forces out of Europe, but pulled a heck of a lot of them out. And we definitely did say, and it's the written record again, how can I say this politely? He's making angry, hacking off a whole lot of people with the changes he's making because it's undercutting the power of the party. And he's putting power in government and in the population. And we are concerned, or we think there's a real chance that there's going to be a move to oust him. And that was 3 years before the move took place. So no, we don't ever get everything right. It's a tough world. And if you think that you're going to go and work in intelligence for another 10 or 20 years and not have every change in our government bring it a new outlook that you have to somehow figure out how to deal with, then you better sign up to Dr. Pangloss. Anyway, no, it wasn't all right, but it definitely was seen coming, and I would argue that the partnership between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev had more impact as a turn point in history than about anything during my recollection of my life.
Very good. Thank you, Doug. From the then analytic trenches, the Kremlinologists speaking about this revolving door of Soviet leaders. David.
Thanks, Nick. All right, good afternoon. It's certainly a pleasure for me to be here with this panel today to give you that working level analyst perspective on President Reagan's use of intelligence. And it's a particular pleasure for me to be doing this here in this magnificent setting of this Reagan Presidential Library. Although I really do have to tell you, this really doesn't remind me much of a typical library setup whatsoever. I mean, Duke, we had a wonderful tour of the entire library facility this morning. A couple hours, we saw all those thousands of documents and artifacts and things like that. But I couldn't find a card catalog anywhere. And I couldn't see anything on the shelves that was organized around the good old Dewey Decimal System. So does anybody in the room remember the old Dewey Decimal System? All right, if that's
It's an older audience.
yeah, those of you with your hands up must be very old, so I'll speak loudly into the microphone here. But I would bet that Ronald Reagan would have his hand up on that question. And I also would bet that if Reagan were in a library like this, that was organized around that old Dewey Decimal System, he would most often be browsing around in the 920 section. So here's your real test here today. What was the 920 section in the old Dewey Decimal System? Anybody? Right, the biographies, the who's who section, the people section. And Reagan would have been spending most of his time in that section because of his gut feel and his understanding for the importance of knowing about and understanding the people behind the issues of the day. All right? And that's why he was particularly fascinated, and that's what I'm going to focus my remarks on here today, by what we could offer him from CIA in what we call leadership analysis, the study and the profiles of the foreign officials that he was dealing with, especially of the Soviet leaders. Most of us, of course, automatically tend to associate President Reagan with his dealings with Gorbachev, and that's certainly what I'll be focusing on quite a bit here. But as has been mentioned already, it's important for us to remember that the entire first term, the first 4 years when President Reagan was in office, were spent in the pre-Gorbachev days, with Brezhnev, and then Andropov, and then Chernenko, right? Before Gorbachev finally came into power in March 1985, right? Just a couple months after Reagan's second inauguration. Right? But the president really did love all those succession jockeying analyses and profiles we gave him, those annotated photos of who's standing next to who on the Kremlin wall there. Right? And I don't know whether it shows up in his personal diaries and notes or not, but I know that he was also quite taken by that Russian term of kto kovo, and General Kalugin will know that one with us. It's roughly translated as who's playing who, right? Or who's doing what to who, or who's on first, right? Right. Everybody, as Ken Edelman mentioned, always remembers President Reagan saying that Russian proverb, doveryai no proveryai, trust but verify, right? But I think it was this kto kovo phrase that Reagan was most seized with during those succession scenarios and was fascinated by these different profiles on the different contenders that we were giving him all the time. And that particularly included our profiles on this up-and-coming young fella from Stavropol named Gorbachev, who had the agriculture portfolio at that time on the leadership. So Reagan initially referred to him as the tractor guy, you know, when he'd be getting the studies and looking at things like that, as well as the other contenders. And it was more than 8 months after Gorbachev first came into power before Reagan had that chance to meet him in November of that year in Geneva. But during those 8 months, he avidly read all the profiles and the portraits that we could give him of Gorbachev and the other folks on the leadership team there. And he even poured through the video profiles that we'd put together on Gorbachev, on the new foreign minister, Edward Shevardnadze, so that he could kind of be ready for his first meetings with all these folks. And he also really took on board the personal comments that he was able to get from Margaret Thatcher, who had met with Gorbachev early on that year, and who, as we've heard, gave that famous well-known phrase that, I like Mr. Gorbachev. I think we can do business together. And here, I can't emphasize enough the importance of that theme from President Reagan's perspective, on the importance of doing business with his new Soviet leadership as one of the key tenets and intelligence issues in forging his new relationship with Moscow. And in that context, I want to mention for just a minute here the special role that Reagan's Commerce Secretary, Malcolm Baldrige, played over those years before his unfortunate death from a horse riding accident in July of 1987, as a key point man in President Reagan's agenda to promote trade and business with the Soviet Union as a part of this new era along with the arms control. Now, my wife Brenda, who is with us here in the audience today, was on Secretary Baldridge's personal staff during those years. So I was fortunate enough to have several opportunities to meet privately with Baldrige and to brief him on the officials that he was dealing with from the Soviet Union, but also to glean some insights from him on his thinking and President Reagan's thinking on the commerce and business intelligence aspects of this new administration's relationship with Moscow. And if we do have a little bit of time in the question-answer period or breaks later, then I'll have a couple of fun anecdotes that I picked up from Secretary Baldrige that I can pass on to you regarding Reagan's use of intelligence and our boss at that time, Director Casey. So maybe we'll have a chance to do some of that. But I do want to focus here on this special Reagan-Gorbachev relationship and how our agency's intelligence and profiles helped to shape all that. And I think with all the different biographic and personality profiles on Gorbachev that we updated and provided to President Reagan during those 4 summit meetings that he had with him, I think the biggest impact was Reagan's fascination with any intelligence insights that we could give him on how Gorbachev thinks, his thought processes, his approaches and reasoning behind the arms control and other issues that the two men were negotiating and discussing. And one of the clear highlights for me here was the historical analogy or the intelligence precedent insight that Reagan drew on comparisons of leadership style differences that we had described to him that had been at play several years earlier at the famous Camp David Accords that his predecessor, President Carter, had conducted back in 1978 with Egyptian President Sadat, who, as you may recall, was sadly assassinated in Cairo in 1981 during Reagan's first year in office, and with Israeli Prime Minister Begin. And if I actually could figure out this computerized card catalog system here in the Reagan Library, I'd love to see what President Reagan's own notes or diary showed about his discussions with Carter back then on getting his tips for dealing with foreign leaders with such different thinking and negotiating styles. In this Camp David analogy, Sadat, very much like Reagan, was clearly the big picture guy who wanted to talk on and on about the grander human emotional aspects of generational peace and of making the world safer for our children's children. Begin, on the other hand, had little time for that. He wanted to cut right to the chase and pick up the draft treaty paper that was being negotiated with a sharp pencil and say, now I want to make this change on page 3, paragraph 4, line 7. Right? I mean, you could hardly have those two men, Begin and Sadat, in the same room together until it was time for the final handshakes and signing the papers that their aides had finally hammered out. And for the Reagan-Gorbachev dynamics, I think there was a little bit of this same stylistic difference theme being played out. Gorbachev was very much the business guy who had little interest in or capability for what Reagan loved and flourished in, which of course revolved around combining the business detail with personal anecdotes and small talk. And I think that it was one of Reagan's chief frustrations that he wasn't able to get Gorbachev to open up more and loosen up and engage in that kind of small talk about his life in Russia, his agricultural background, family stuff, sports, the weather, anything. Certainly not trying to pry secrets out of him, but just trying to make that personal, friendly kind of small talk. And it was almost like Gorbachev, for the most part, was constitutionally incapable of doing that, which of course was the exact opposite of Ronald Reagan. And it's not like Reagan didn't try to engage Gorbachev more in this kind of small talk or family talk. He really did. In fact, the theme I'd like to kind of close on here within my time limit is to make the point of how Reagan actually looked on his relationship with those of us in the intelligence community as a two-way street. In addition to being an avid consumer of whatever we could provide him in the way of leadership profiles and analyses on Gorbachev or the other officials he was dealing with, he also actually liked to think of himself as an intelligence collector, always on the lookout for new tidbits or facts that he could pass on back to us to help us flesh out or update our profiles. I guess we trained him pretty well on that score. In fact, it was just before his Washington summit meeting with Gorbachev here that President Reagan actually invited us to provide him with a list of questions about Gorbachev that we would most like him to try to get more information on. So we did, through Ambassador Matlock and the NSC staff. And during that entire summit, the president kept with him that little list of a dozen or so questions that we had given him on different aspects about Gorbachev's background, his family, any remarks that he would make on some of his dealings with other Kremlin associates back home, things like that. And we were pleasantly shocked when Matlock called us back to his office the following week and actually gave us that sheet of questions back with Reagan's personal handwritten notes in the margins on every one of those questions and his RR initials right up on the top. I almost wish we could have kept that sell on eBay later, but that wouldn't have been appropriate at the time, I guess. Even though there really wasn't much new that he was able to provide us on those questions. In fact, his tone was almost apologetic that he wasn't able to get Gorbachev to loosen up more and mention and talk about some of these issues that weren't on his official talking point script. But the fact that President Reagan was willing to take the time and the effort to try to answer those questions for us is certainly illustrative of the kind of president he was, of how he used intelligence, and of how much he valued our role and the community's role in help shaping his dealings with Gorbachev and these other foreign leaders, and how it was just his nature to want to make that a two-way street and look for ways to help us do our jobs better. So with that, I'm ready to close here, but my current hat as a CIA Kent School training instructor for our new analysts inside of me compels me to want to quickly restate for you here the 4 themes that I hope you've been taking notes on and are going to remember from these remarks here today. So here they are. Number 1, how much the president really did rely on and utilize our intelligence personality profiles and analyses on the Soviet leaders he was dealing with. Number 2, the primacy that he placed on economic and commercial and business intelligence in dealing with the Soviet Union and the societal issues and how the economy was affecting life in Russia, and how Secretary Baldrige was his point man for so much of that policy and intelligence. Number 3, how Reagan seriously took the point of following historical intelligence precedents and analogies, like the Camp David Accords, in preparing for his own negotiations with foreign officials. And number 4, how Reagan treated his dealings with those of us in the intelligence community as a two-way street, as an avid consumer of intelligence, but also as trying to help us enrich our understanding and our holdings for his use and for future consumers as well. So it's only fair for me to remind you here that all 4 of those points will be on your final exam at the end of this symposium. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, David.
Excuse me,
I also want to mention that the video on the Andropov succession that was produced for President Reagan is included in your DVD.
Can I just add one point here? When you read those reports he was describing about Gorbachev, it'll say source with access. That's the president he was talking about.
Our best source. Dr. Berkowitz.
Yeah, I'm going to keep this short because I want to leave a lot of time for discussion. But I'd like to talk a little bit about the article that I wrote that appears in this booklet. And Nick has asked me to talk a little bit about how that reflected the thinking of the typical. Well, you need to listen more closely. I remember I briefly served for a Senate Intelligence Committee for about a year and a half. And this is when Bill Casey was the DCI. And he was notorious for having selective fidelity in his speaking presentations. And I noticed that when I got to the committee that the committee had rigged up these microphones that started a long gooseneck and came right here, and you couldn't possibly avoid it. But what I'd like to talk a little bit about today is the article that I wrote that talks about the actual record of the intelligence community in predicting the Soviet decline and collapse, and talk a little bit about why, even to this day, there's misunderstanding about how well the community performed. And then conclude with discussing what are the lessons that we can draw from this episode. In the mid-1990s, around 1994, some of the Cold War intelligence estimates were just beginning to be declassified and released. And an old classmate of mine, Jeff Richardson, who has written extensively on intelligence and uses the Freedom of Information Act extensively, got a hold of some of these estimates. They'd been previously cited in a Harvard Kennedy School study. And Jeff, who knew me from graduate school, called me and he said, you know, Bruce, I've been looking at these estimates and they're pretty good. You know, the intelligence community wasn't that far off the mark. Now, this was in the early 90s, and the common consensus was just starting to form that the intelligence community had blown the estimate of the century, you know, the collapse of the Soviet Union. That was the common wisdom. As a matter of fact, that was one of the reasons why the Aspen-Brown Commission was established in 1994. And so Jeff pressed me a bit more, and so we decided, well, you know, this might make the makings of a good article to sort of begin to, we never really said set the record straight, but to at least put the record on the table. And so having worked in the past with many of my colleagues who worked on those estimates, I set up a couple of interviews, and we also talked to many of the policymakers, and we published a article in the National Interest in 1995 called The Myth of the Soviet Collapse. And we showed that the record that had been released up to then showed that if you measured the intelligence community along 3 dimensions, giving good strategic warning, giving good intermediate warning, and giving good immediate warning, that they did pretty well. Strategic warnings say telling leaders 10 years before the fact that your major adversary has some serious problems that has implications for how you're going to deal with them down the road. Intermediate warning, say 5 years or so before the fact, that you can see the political forces starting to take shape that might influence events based on the Soviet decline. And then immediate warning, telling the policymaker that you've got specific things to watch for, that this is reaching a crisis point, and if you meet conditions A, B, and C, expect big things to happen, and then paint out what the scenarios will be. So we published this, and our assessment was that the intelligence community actually did pretty well. Now, about 10 years later, the editor who had me work on that article with Jeff came back to me and said, well, you know, we'd like you to write another article, revisit this topic again, because even now, many years later, people still seem to think in some fundamental way that the intelligence community failed to predict the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I wrote another article, and that's the one that appears in your book. And I think that one of the reasons why, even after the documentary record had become really well published, I mean, by that time, not only did we have those early NIEs, but the CIA itself had published, I think, most of the major NIEs on both the political and the military side for its 1999 conference at the end of the Cold War. That even then people were still not fully aware of what the record said. And I think that at that point, in addition to all the other reasons, the initial lack of information, the fact that American policymakers seem to have some difficulty coming to grip with the changing events in the Soviet Union, and also some people who just insisted on pushing this line that the intelligence community in this case failed, In addition to all that, I think that one of the reasons why people were not fully aware of what the quality of intelligence was that the linkage between intelligence and policy had not been understood. Well, towards the end of the 90s and into the years that followed, the NSC, the National Security Archives, were also opened, and we began to see some of the policy directives that came out, that were issued rather, during the Reagan and then later in the Bush administration. And what we saw then was something that was even more interesting, which was that not only was the intelligence, for the most part, pretty good in anticipating Soviet decline, seeing the political forces leading to a Soviet crisis, and then giving tactical warning of the crisis itself, but it had a direct effect on policy, so that you could see what the intelligence was saying, and you could see how it actually affected Ronald Reagan's policies for dealing with the Soviet Union. And much of that is there in the article, and I'd suggest and encourage you to read it. The point is, though, that I'd like to leave you with in answering Nick's request to sort of talk about the zeitgeist within the intelligence community at the time, is that the zeitgeist within the intelligence community is that we sort of took the Soviet decline as a given. We weren't surprised by it. We were following it all the time. I can remember actually having a conversation with one of my colleagues who's here today. And he said, you know, next year, this is in 1979, he said, you know, they aren't going to have any growth next year. You know, it might be 0.5%, it might be 1%, but for all intents and purposes, the Soviet, and that is, for an analyst, that's a big deal. But it wasn't as though we were having to wrestle with the issue of whether or not they were in decline. The context that we worked in was, okay, here's the decline. Now what's going to happen? And that was the intelligence challenge. And the options, as Doug kind of alluded to, was that, well, they are either going to have to pick and choose what they're going to do with their limited resources, maybe selectively continue their military buildup, which at the time we just saw as this sort of inexorable force. Or perhaps they will just have to gut it out and make the Soviet people do with even less than what they were doing then. Or perhaps they were going to have to rethink their military buildup. That was the big challenge, and that was the context. That context was what moved up to the National Security Council and the White House. And so that was the context that Ronald Reagan was working from as he realized that the Soviets were in this pinch and that was the big question. How do we deal with that? And that's what got translated into policy. And if you look at the National Security Council documents, you'll see that US policy was aimed in forcing this transformation of the Soviet Union. Now, the policies never said that we were going to try to bring the Soviet Union down. The policy said that what we're going to try to do is take advantage of this situation to channel the Soviet. And they always refer to the Soviets, not the Russians, which sort of assumed that the Soviet system itself was going to survive, but in some fundamentally modified form. And that's what the policy was. And the policy worked. It was transformed, maybe not in the way that we had fully anticipated, but it was fundamentally transformed because of these tidal forces that we followed all during that time. So what are the lessons to be learned from this? I think one thing that I'd really like to get across to you is this: what is the atmosphere in which intelligence analysis operates? In routine business, analysts really are rarely asked galactic questions like whither the Soviet Union or whither Mao. It's a day-to-day process. Thousands of people go to work and work on their piece of the problem. And what happens over time is that this group of people who is working together and talking together, they develop collective knowledge. That's probably the most important organizational asset of the U.S. intelligence community's analytic cadre, is this collective understanding of a target that usually other people don't have the ability or interest or opportunity to follow at that level of detail. And ideas get kicked around. That analysis, by the way, gets translated into better collection, because when we put together estimates, it's not to come up with a grand truth so much as to summarize the collective wisdom of the community, including where we have gaps. And it's those understanding of where the gaps are that then drive both day-to-day and major investments to try to fill them. And over time, this knowledge accumulates. And if, as in this case, it's well connected to the consumer and the consumer asks intelligent questions and is willing to act on that information, the process works. And if you really have the right people in the right time, you win the Cold War. So I'll leave you with that.
Thank you.
Admiral Inman.
And I start by making sure you can hear me in the back. July 1978. I'd been invited to the Bohemian Grove in Northern California for the former DCI George H.W. Bush to make his first lakeside speech. There were 3 of us, active duty, 2 4-stars, 1 3-star admirals, and we went on back to George H.W. Bush's camp for lunch, and there among the guests was President Reagan, Governor Reagan. Along the way, he made a 5-minute oration on fighting the Barbary pirates. And it was a magnificently inspirational grab, which Mr. Bush turned to me and said, "Damn, he's good," which was foreshadowing what was going to happen 2 years later. Fast forward, the election, November 1980. About a week later, I got a call from the CIA head of the transition for the incoming administration, saying they'd like you to be the new Deputy Director of Central Intelligence. And I said, no, thank you. I'm retiring next summer. I'm blocking promotion opportunities for bright youngsters whose careers I'd helped develop. I'd already been a flag officer 2 years longer than any of my previous intelligence predecessors. About a week later, I got a call from the head of the transition team saying, you know, I understand you weren't interested in being the DDCI, and I was even more explicit that I did not want the job and I planned to retire. I go out to Australia for a trip with my Australian counterparts. In the office of the Secretary of Defense, I get called out by Bill Middendorf, former Secretary of the Navy, saying, Bobby, I can't understand you're turning down this wonderful opportunity to be the Deputy Director of Central Intelligence. And I was even more blunt with my admired former Secretary about my plans. Fast forward, 21st of January. Secretary comes running in saying the President's calling. And I presumed it was President Carter continuing the dialogue that they're getting the hostages out of Iran. It was the President. Couldn't have been more charming. And then laid out the entire story for me. After they lost the primary in New Hampshire, he had asked Bill Casey to chair the campaign. And he'd asked Casey, what do you want to do if we're successful? And his response was, well, if I can't be Secretary of State, I'd like to be Director of Central Intelligence. He'd had a great time early in his life running OSS operations in Europe. Fast forward, election night, they're sitting there watching the returns. It's clear that he's won. The president-elect said, I turned to Bill and said, Bill, are you ready to be the Director of Central Intelligence? He said, if I can't be the Secretary of State. They all laughed. Okay. About an hour later, call coming in from Senator Barry Goldwater, who got Governor Reagan into politics in a big way, saying, congratulating us, and said, I just have one request. I have the perfect candidate for you to be the Director of Central Intelligence. He's currently the Director of the National Security Agency, Vice Admiral Bobby Inman. And Governor said, well, Barry, I appreciate that. I've met him, but I've already given the job to Bill Casey. Long silence, because there was deep animosity between Goldwater and Casey from Republican Party politics. Over the next week, President-elect said he got more calls about me than any other single candidate for any job, as Goldwater and Moynihan were out marshaling all of their friends to call. And then came the idea, well, let's do a shotgun marriage and have Casey and Inman satisfy the Congress as well. And so, Admiral, now we're in office, and speaking as your commander-in-chief, I need you, and I want you to take the job as Bill Casey's deputy. That under the circumstances, Mr. President, I'd be honored, but hopefully no more than 18 months to 2 years. And he agreed to that. I said, by the way, thank you for taking it. I'm going to nominate you for a 4th star. So that's how this ersatz career ended up with 4 stars. It was an unusual arrangement in many ways. Normally, the Director of Central Intelligence deals with the outside world, and the Deputy Director runs CIA day to day. That wasn't what Bill Casey wanted at all. He wanted to run the clandestine service and the analytical arm personally. Didn't want to have anything to do with science and technology or administration. Minimal involvement with the other agencies, and certainly not with the budgets. But he wanted to do all of the communications with the president. So we marched off on that track. But there was a little modification then of that last part when the president talked about rebuilding the intelligence community, and Bill Casey told him of the division of effort he'd made. So the president sent for me to say he wanted to rebuild the intelligence community, spend whatever needed to be spent to do it, and told Frank Carlucci, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, find the place to hide the request, whatever he wanted. I found we set out to do a 5-year plan and found, and this is a lesson for us again now, we had drawn down the training establishments so much that there were finite limits of how many people we could train and position and put to work rebuilding the intelligence community. I never encountered the president that he didn't have a joke to tell, a warmth. He didn't need script writers. He was just naturally an enormously warm, engaging person. Fairly early on, I was listening to Ken Adelman. He made a comment at one of the meetings that nothing really good for the country had ever come from arms control agreements. So I spoke up and begged to differ. He said, well, tell me. So I described how the Soviets had made a decision because of the limits to put much more of their capability in land and mobile missiles and less in undersea missiles. The president's response was, nobody ever told me that. And then he used it later. Point here, he picked up very quickly. When he was interested, he retained, and he used it in the appropriate manner. My last meeting with him, shortly before I was leaving on that 18-month line, the British had moved into the Falklands. They were at the outer limits of their military capabilities. Mrs. Thatcher had asked for the use of Ascension Island to stage support. Ascension Island was a British territory, but it was entirely ceded over to the U.S. National Security Agency. Had a major collection site there. There was an airfield. So we had a meeting to deal with the request, and the very learned ambassador of the UN, Jean Kirkpatrick, great friendships in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in Argentina, held forth, oh, you can't possibly do that, Mr. President. It would destroy hemispheric solidarity. And that just pressed my button. Instead of being intimidated, I sort of outburst, what hemispheric solidarity? It's a myth. It's never existed. And the British have been with us every time we've been in any conflict or we've had a need. They've always been there. And the president smiled and said, sorry, Jean, and turned and said, tell Maggie she can use Ascension Island. The quick ability to see the large picture and where it needed. He was truly a very remarkable man to work with. Back on schedule.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Obviously, we're over time on the schedule, but Duke Blackwood has assured me that we need not curtail question and answers, so we'll take questions for some minutes. I want to remind everyone of the need actually to ask a question instead of simply commenting. And I'll shamelessly exploit my position by asking the first question of the Soviet analysts, Doug McCacken and David Lodge. It was interesting to me during Ambassador Edelman's presentation that he made certain assertions that, as a historian, I had some doubts about. And I wonder if you would comment on the idea that trying to figure out Gorbachev's economic program was a waste of time and resources, that the agency ignored the significance of Chernobyl in the Soviet collapse, and that CIA did no opportunity analysis. You could take any or all parts of that question.
Yeah. I'll leave Chernobyl. Does this thing work now?
Yes.
Yeah. I'll leave Chernobyl right here. The first one, what was your first question again?
Figuring out Gorbachev's economic.
Well, actually, I was tempted at the time he said that to give him a two-word answer. Initials are B and S, but anyway, it was Gorbachev's economic objectives. Now, I think there's a story, a book written about Gorbachev by a guy who was his assistant when he started out in the agricultural and then portfolio for the Politburo when he moved up and he stayed with him. His name is Chernayev, I think, isn't it?
Yeah.
Anyway, and he described, he said, Gorby did not ever have a master plan. He was just winging it step by step. What he did know was where he wanted to get. And that was clear from his plan. And the way we described it was he was taking it, kind of inventing it as he went along. Like none of our presidents have ever done anything like that. But
Good.
anyway, but so I'd say that's just nonsense. That was, and the third one on the list was
Opportunity analysis. I'm not sure that the head of Arms Control and Disarmament Agency would have seen an opportunity analysis given to the president, frankly.
Again, that was one of the priorities, and as I say, the first opportunity analysis that was delivered was, they've gone through 3 coffins in a row, and the economy's going down, and this guy was being touted by all the people. He was even reported to have been by one of the leading Czech dissidents in '68 who actually had gone to college, university in Moscow when he was in the 50s, who had told us later that Gorbachev was a college classmate, and that this was not Dubček, Milnarz, Anyway, so that Gorbachev, of all the college students he went to school with in Moscow, who was a Russian, who was more like an East European, it was this guy Gorbachev.
Yeah.
So we were absolutely hooked on him from the beginning. We just described Gorbachev himself as an opportunity.
Yeah, and those analyses, many of those are actually included in the DVD. David, on Chernobyl, what's the story there?
I really don't have too much to add on that one, only to say the fact that I think even Gorbachev himself for a while didn't really know how bad that was, that some of that was even being withheld from him. And the more that became clear as the weeks and months went by, it's part of what drove him, as Ken mentioned, to even open up more in Reykjavik that fall and begin to push more towards scaling back on nuclear, both weapons and on the nuclear energy front. But I'll also just comment very briefly here on that economic and commercial front. I think Reagan based a lot of his thinking here on the clear assumption, which to him was a no-brainer, that of course the Russians, like anybody else, would want more open trade, more commerce, more opportunity to engage with the West and buy goods and sell goods and things like that. So the trade and economic councils and the commercial enterprises that he instituted with the Soviet Union were one of the key underpinnings of his entire relationship, along with the arms control and the military buildup to keep the pressure on or whatnot. But I don't think there was any doubt in his mind that he was envisioning McDonald's on the corners of the streets in Moscow and Coca-Cola signs everywhere and movie theaters showing Western movies and things like that, that this was just a natural thing that the Soviet Union or the other parts of the world would aspire to as well. And that really was one of the carrots, one of the opportunities that we had to promote. Whatever the Kremlin leaders were saying, this was what the Russian people surely wanted, and let's make that more available and make that happen more, and the rest will take care of itself.
Very good. Okay, let's open it up to the audience. Yes, sir. If you're soft-spoken, please come to the microphone. Super.
Beginning in 47, leadership of the country wanted encyclopedic knowledge of the entire outside world, and resources flowed to build that. And there was a great build-up from 47 that plateaued about 58. Large numbers of people around the world, maintaining a national intelligence survey on every country process. Plateau hit in 58, continued to 64. Decision to get into Vietnam overtly, needed more tactical support. Instead of continuing to add, as in the previous era, it was shift resources. So we gave up first in-depth look at Latin America, next year Africa, I've got those reversed, and then the next year Western Europe. Maintained Middle East because of interest in Israel's security, and then focused on the communist bloc. In 67, President Johnson was worried about balanced payments. And so he instructed every U.S. representative, ambassador or consul general, your first responsibility is to reduce the official American presence in your country. Each president followed that until President Reagan. Over that time frame, 40% of the overt human observers, Foreign Service, military attaches, commerce attaches, were reduced. You didn't take in, focus on, you didn't need a lot of the languages because you weren't focused on them anymore. That's where the real damage was done to the human intelligence capabilities. It was more cost effective to run them out of embassies than through non-official cover. So another great switch in the process. So there's a lot of myths about how we got into the condition of very shallow human intelligence. We maintained some terrific clandestine, focused effort, and with a lot of successes that hopefully you won't read about for another 40 years. But it was the overt human collection capability that was decimated and has never really been rebuilt.
Thank you, sir. Yes, sir.
With regard to your getting information to the president in a very short fashion, for example, when Bin Laden released that tape in 2002,
Right.
I'm in geology. I spent about an hour or two trying to figure out where he was.
Good for you.
The president has a tremendous amount of, well, I think I found it. There's just no way to communicate with him at the time. In any event, when you've got a president who's got 10,000 other items on their agenda, and yet you've got to distill, for example, the blowing up of a Marine barracks and get the intelligence to him in a nutshell from thousands and thousands of hours of information, how exactly do you do that?
Bruce, you want to take care of that?
Sure. Yeah, I think that that's related to another one of those myths about how intelligence works. The president is a very important consumer, the most important consumer. But the thing that characterizes our national security establishment today is that a lot of people, all down the chain, military branches, military, diplomatic, and so on, all need intelligence. So thinking in terms of how do you deliver intelligence specifically to the president isn't necessarily the problem. The problem is getting the tailored product to all these different users who have their own responsibilities so that they can do their jobs. And also within the intelligence community itself, it's increasingly important to get analysts across many different organizations with different expertise to talk to each other so they can exchange information and find solutions that require this kind of combined knowledge, and also get the collectors who are increasingly interdependent. These days, in order to get one kind of intelligence, you're apt to need a different kind of access. So you have to get the technical operators to work with the human operators, and you have to have the different kinds of technical operators to all work together. So focusing on that one critical node of the president, as important as he may be, isn't going to solve your problem. You need to have greater interconnectivity throughout the enterprise.
Quick observation, if I may.
Yes.
22 years in the intelligence community, dealing with a lot of users, consumers across all those organizations. I distill two direct results. If what I provided them fit their preconceptions, I heard how brilliant I was. And if what I gave them conflicted with their views, that's a bunch of garbage. Where did you come up with those ideas? So there's the reality that we may work to produce, the consumer, the user may or may not have an open mind for what we're producing.
If I can make one quick input, as shocking as this may seem, I ran into that same problem in my
Very good. Very good. We had a question up there. Yes, sir.
I seem to recall that Reagan and Caspar Weinberger said we're going to increase defense spending to the point that the Soviets will go bankrupt trying to keep up. Want to comment on that?
I don't think it was phrased exactly that way, but the reality was President Reagan was absolutely committed to rebuilding our defense capabilities as well as the intelligence capability. And he particularly focused on the reality of the need for expanding conventional forces. Soviets saw that as a major challenge. The Chief of the General Staff, Ogarkov, said that if we don't invest more in smart conventional forces, we're going to fall behind in the superpower status. The answer he got back was they couldn't afford to spend more in the process. So it was not a deliberate effort to bankrupt the Soviet Union. It was a deliberate effort to build the scale of forces and capabilities that President Reagan thought this country needed to have.
Governor Wilson, you had a question.
Yes,
Well, first of all,
The question was, how did we, what was the sources of our knowledge for assessing the Soviet SDI system in this calculus between how much are we going to spend on it versus what they can do?
the simple, so I don't want to mess up happy hour, which will be coming along shortly. SDI, the concept, because the Soviets saw themselves as behind the curve, and Admiral Idman mentioned this Ogarkov statement. He was actually at the time recommending, he said, I think I quoted exactly, nuclear war is a war that can never be fought and won. Well, some people took that one phrase out of his memo to say he was just a peacenik, which is not what he was saying. He was saying, instead of spending all our money on this, and the Americans are getting 9 miles ahead of us on the kind of stuff we might actually have to fight. So he was trying to reallocate their resources. As far as SDI is concerned, they saw that as a clear, his military staff, and we had plenty of information on that, they saw that as the balance tipper. So that now, if we did actually have a strategic missile defense system that actually worked, now they may have thought we could have done it. There's some people on our side who weren't sure we could do it. Well, that would just tip the whole scale and put them in a situation of having to deal with it. Interestingly enough, the Reykjavik description was a simple case of, I'm going to give you an abstract political science. A policymaker's up trying to make a deal, but the deal, he's got a faction he can't, absolutely will blow his head off if he accepts it, so he can't accept it. And in a sense, SDI was that way at Reykjavik. He could not say yes to all these other things while not stopping SDI, because it was a double whammy. I'm reducing, at the same time this guy's building up his defense against it. And it was just a total deal breaker.
I understand that. I'm just saying, how did we know, how did we have an accurate assessment of what their capability was, what it cost us?
To violate SDI?
No, we had a substantial disagreement within the intelligence community. There were some who thought they were far ahead of where they actually were in, beam weapons, all things along the way. It turned out, reality, they were much further behind than even the advocates thought. So there was a combination that they did not have the technical capacity and they didn't have the resources to spend.
And that was exactly what made it, they were already seeing themselves as behind. And when they saw SDI, even the concept of it was something that they saw. Now, on our side, there are some people who thought they could and some couldn't, but the most important perception at that time was their perception that that was going to completely tip the scales in the U.S. favor.
Yeah, they thought we could do it.
Right. We could go on, but I'm getting the high sign, and much as I'd like to go on, I'd like to thank our panelists for this illuminating discussion. We've got a break scheduled. Duke, how much do we want to take? 5 minutes, and we'll start the next panel. Thank you.